World War II had left much of Europe in ruins. The Allied forces, having successfully defeated Nazi Germany, were now tasked with rebuilding the continent, and for many prisoners of war, that meant finally being freed from the brutal conditions of captivity. But the liberation of POWs, those who had been subjected to the horrors of war, wasn't just about the physical act of release. It was about returning to a world that had been irrevocably changed, and for some, it was the beginning of a complicated emotional journey that would not always end in joy. In the final days of the war, as Germany's surrender loomed, thousands of German soldiers, along with civilians, including women, found themselves in the hands of the victorious Allies. Among them were the women who had been taken as prisoners of war, POWs, during the conflict. While most people might assume that the immediate prospect of freedom would be welcomed with open arms, the response of some German female POWs was nothing short of unexpected. These women, many of whom had been imprisoned for years, had endured hardships that ranged from the physical toll of malnutrition to the psychological strain of being forced to confront a new identity, one not defined by their roles in Nazi Germany, but by their status as prisoners. When the day finally came, when the Allied forces declared their freedom, what happened next shocked their captors and the world. Many of these German women, instead of rushing to return to their homeland, expressed a powerful, almost perplexing, desire to remain. This story begins with the liberation of German female POWs and the initial shock that came with their release. In this section, we'll explore the circumstances that led to their captivity, the experiences that shaped their identities, and the complicated emotions that surfaced as freedom was suddenly within their grasp. The women who found themselves imprisoned during World War II were not only the wives and mothers of German soldiers, they were also women who played active roles in the war effort. Many were members of auxiliary forces like the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, the female wing of the Nazi Party, or worked in support roles such as nurses, secretaries, or telephone operators. Some were also conscripted into auxiliary roles in the military. These women, though not combatants in the traditional sense, were still caught in the chaos and destruction of war. While the majority of soldiers captured were male, the treatment of female POWs during World War II is an often overlooked chapter in history. After Germany's surrender, the Allies found themselves with thousands of female prisoners, some captured as civilians, others as military auxiliaries, held in internment camps. Many of these women had no idea what would happen to them once they were captured. While male POWs were often the subject of wartime propaganda, women's roles were less clearly defined. This led to a complex situation where, upon liberation, the women were seen as both victims and perpetrators, with mixed emotions from both the Allied forces and their own countrymen. At the close of the war, the Allied forces, who were eager to establish new post-war relations and restore order, were faced with the task of deciding what to do with these female POWs. While some women were simply released and sent home, others were placed into displaced persons camps where they were forced to wait until their respective countries could deal with them. In the spring and summer of 1945, as the war came to an end, the Allies began the process of releasing POWs from the various internment camps across Europe. For many, it was a long-awaited day, a moment they had been waiting for after years of imprisonment. But the reality of freedom didn't feel as liberating as many had hoped. German female POWs, often held in makeshift camps in France, the UK, and other Allied-occupied regions, were informed that they would be released. They were told they could go home, return to their families, and begin to rebuild their lives. This moment was initially seen as a victory, a moment where the promise of freedom was finally realized. However, what unfolded after the announcement was not the overwhelming joy and gratitude that their captors expected. For some women, the idea of returning to Germany, a country shattered by the war, was not a simple matter of returning to the lives they had once known. For many of the women, the immediate reaction was one of shock, not elation. The years of captivity had taken a toll not just on their physical bodies, but on their psyches. They had been living in a world of uncertainty for so long that the prospect of freedom felt surreal. Some women, who had been incarcerated for years, had lost their previous identities. Their sense of self was forever altered by their captivity, and their former lives seemed distant, almost foreign. As the soldiers began to release the women, offering them freedom and the chance to return home, many POWs hesitated. Some simply couldn't believe that the war was over, and they were actually being set free. It was as if they had been in a state of suspended animation, unsure of what their new lives would look like. The war had taken everything from them: family members, homes, and a sense of purpose. Some had lost loved ones in the fighting, while others had been separated from their families for years. In many ways, these women had lived in a constant state of fear and survival, with little understanding of what awaited them once they were freed. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of rushing to leave, some German female POWs expressed a surprising desire to stay. The request stunned their captors, many of whom had expected the women to be eager to return home, to embrace their families, and to rebuild their lives in a devastated post-war Germany. "I want to stay," they said time and time again. This plea was not just an isolated occurrence. It was a collective feeling shared by many. These women had spent so many years in captivity that the prospect of returning to a broken country and re-entering a world that had moved on without them seemed daunting, if not impossible. For some, the idea of being free wasn't as appealing as it might seem. The emotional and psychological toll of the war was something that many Allied captors didn't fully understand. The women had lived through trauma that they could not easily escape. They had lived through starvation, abuse, and uncertainty. Their survival instincts were still in place, and the world outside the camp seemed too frightening to face. Interestingly, some of these women had developed a strange, albeit complex, relationship with their captors. While they had certainly suffered in the camps, they had also received some measure of safety in exchange for their cooperation. Many of the women who had been prisoners in Britain or France formed close bonds with their captors, some even receiving food and care when their conditions were particularly dire. In many ways, these women had adapted to a new way of life. Some POWs were treated more humanely than others, and the harshness of captivity varied. But for many, the prospect of returning to a country devastated by war, with few resources and even fewer opportunities, was a terrifying thought. The decision to stay was a reflection of their fear, but it was also an acknowledgement of how much the war had altered their sense of identity. They didn't know how to be the women they had once been, and they feared that returning home would force them to confront a past they could no longer recognize. The story of the German female POW's unexpected desire to stay in captivity is a narrative shaped by trauma. For many of these women, the years they spent in POW camps were not simply a matter of physical imprisonment. It was an experience that deeply impacted their emotional and psychological well-being. The effects of this trauma would linger far beyond their release, shaping how they viewed freedom and their own sense of identity. The idea of being freed from captivity is often romanticized in historical narratives. We picture the prisoners, whether men or women, embracing freedom with open arms, rushing back to their families, eager to put the horrors of war behind them. Yet for many of the German female POWs, liberation was not a simple or joyous event. Instead, it opened a floodgate of emotions that they were not prepared to face. The trauma of war had altered them in ways they could not easily express, and the world they were now expected to re-enter was foreign and filled with uncertainty. For many, the emotional scars they carried were not visible to the outside world. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, though not widely understood at the time, was a significant issue for many former POWs. These women had endured starvation, abuse, and constant fear of death. The trauma of such an existence was not something that could simply be left behind with their release. These women were emotionally and psychologically broken in ways that they could not immediately fix, and freedom, as it turned out, wasn't a cure. Once liberated, these women were told they could return home to a defeated, war-torn Germany. However, the reality they faced when they arrived was far from the country they had once known. The infrastructure was decimated, food was scarce, and the nation was in ruins. Millions had died, including many of their own families and loved ones. For those who had been imprisoned for years, the return home was akin to stepping into a strange world. The trauma of captivity, combined with the overwhelming destruction of their homeland, made it difficult for many to see their liberation as a true victory. The experience of returning home was also an emotionally complex one. The women were faced with the challenge of reuniting with families who may have had little understanding of what they had endured. The relationships these women had left behind were no longer the same. In some cases, their loved ones had moved on with their lives or even died during the war. The children they had left behind might now be grown, and their spouses might have changed emotionally or physically. In many cases, the women found that they had become strangers in their own homes. This sense of disconnection was particularly painful. After years of separation, the dream of returning home was more complicated than they had imagined. Some women had lost family members, and the homes they had once known were now destroyed. Reuniting with family members was not always the heartwarming experience that they had imagined. Instead, it was often marked by a feeling of alienation, compounded by their own emotional scars. One of the most difficult aspects of returning home for these women was the question of identity. During their time as POWs, many of these women had undergone profound changes. They had been stripped of their former roles and identities as wives, mothers, or daughters, and had been forced to adapt to new roles in captivity. For some, their wartime experiences had completely reshaped their self-perception. The fear, the hunger, the constant trauma had altered who they were in ways they could not easily articulate. Many of the women who had been part of the Nazi war effort felt a sense of shame when they returned home. They were aware that their role in the war was often seen as tainted, particularly as many had been involved in supporting the Nazi regime. However, their feelings were complex. They had been young, many had been coerced or manipulated into their roles, and their involvement in the war effort was not always by choice. Yet, their association with the Nazi Party and the actions of the regime was something they could never fully escape. The sense of guilt and shame was often compounded by their captivity. They had endured unimaginable conditions, but upon their release, they were expected to return to normal life as if nothing had happened. The idea of resuming life as if they were the same people who had left was an impossible notion for many. Their emotional baggage made it difficult to adjust to a life they had once known, and the war had irrevocably changed them. The women's desire to stay in captivity, rather than return to post-war Germany, was not just about wanting to avoid the emotional pain of reintegration. It was also about the sense of security they had found, strange as it might seem, in the POW camps. While their captivity had been brutal and dehumanizing, for some it was also a place where they felt protected. In the camps, they had been removed from the chaos of the war and had, in some ways, adapted to the rhythm of survival. Their daily routines, even if harsh, had become a form of structure that provided them with a sense of control over their lives. In some camps, the women had been given tasks to do, and the routine of working, eating, and sleeping offered a sense of stability. While they were imprisoned, they were shielded from the dangers and uncertainties of the outside world. This sense of control, no matter how limited, became a part of their identity. When they were released, they were faced with a world that seemed uncontrollable, a world filled with dangers that they had long tried to avoid. The desire to remain in captivity also stemmed from the fear of returning to a Germany that had been completely altered by the war. Some women had lost everything, and they feared that returning to a country in ruins would only deepen their sense of loss. For these women, staying in captivity, even if it meant remaining in the hands of their former captors, seemed like a safer, more predictable option. The psychological battle between the freedom offered by the Allies and the fear of returning to an unfamiliar, broken world was one that many German female POWs faced after their release. They had lived in a state of survival for so long that freedom, with all its uncertainties, seemed overwhelming. This fear of the unknown, coupled with the trauma they had endured, made it difficult for them to embrace the liberty they had been given. In many cases, this fear was tied to a deep-seated sense of insecurity. These women had witnessed the collapse of their nation, the destruction of their homes, and the loss of loved ones. They had been subjected to the brutal realities of war and captivity, and the world they were being sent back to felt alien and hostile. Returning to a shattered Germany was not the fresh start they had hoped for. It was a reminder of everything they had lost. For these women, the idea of freedom wasn't as liberating as it seemed. Their trauma made it difficult for them to see liberation as anything other than another uncertain, overwhelming transition. After the initial shock of their release, Many German female POWs found themselves grappling with a new set of challenges: how to reintegrate into a society that had drastically changed during the war. The physical wounds of captivity, though visible to their captors, were only part of the story. The deeper, more profound scars were those left on their psyches. Their return to post-war Germany was not just about rebuilding their physical lives, but also about coming to terms with the emotional and psychological toll of their captivity. For many of these women, the idea of resuming normal life was a daunting and overwhelming one. They had lived in a constant state of survival, and the structure and routines of the POW camps had provided them with a semblance of order in a world turned upside down. Returning to a country in ruins, where they were expected to simply pick up the pieces of their lives, felt impossible. It wasn't just their homes that had been destroyed. It was their very sense of self, their identities as women and citizens, that had been shattered by the brutal realities of war and captivity. The first step in reintegration was returning home, but for many, this was just the beginning of a long and painful journey. For women who had lost everything: homes, family members, livelihoods, rebuilding their lives felt like an insurmountable task. They were expected to resume their roles in a society that had moved on without them, but the emotional toll of their experiences made it difficult to step back into a world that no longer felt like their own. The return of these women to their families was not the heartwarming reunion that many had imagined. The emotional distance between the returning POWs and their families was a constant barrier to reconnecting. For those who had been separated for years, the very idea of returning to their previous roles as wives, mothers, and daughters felt like a betrayal of their own trauma. Many of the women who had been in captivity had formed their own coping mechanisms, routines, behaviors, and ways of surviving that no longer fit into the family dynamics they had left behind. The relationships with their spouses were especially difficult to rebuild. Many of these women had been married before the war, but the person they were upon their return was often unrecognizable to their husbands. The trauma of captivity had changed them in ways that were hard to articulate. Their emotional withdrawal, inability to connect, and moments of deep despair were often misunderstood by their spouses, who had their own struggles with loss and grief. The war had created a gap between them that could not be easily bridged. For many children, the return of their mothers was just as complicated. Young children who had been separated from their mothers for years had grown up without them, and the bond they once shared had faded with time. For older children, there was the added challenge of navigating their own trauma while also trying to understand their mother's pain. The women's PTSD and emotional scars created an invisible wall between them and their families, making it difficult for them to reconnect in meaningful ways. In some cases, the emotional disconnect was so deep that the families struggled to communicate. The women who had been prisoners were now trapped in their own emotional silence, unable to express the horrors they had lived through. This silence further deepened the divide between them and their loved ones. The fear, the shame, and the uncertainty about how to navigate their post-war lives left many women feeling isolated within their own families. In the years following their return, the psychological toll of captivity became more apparent, not only for the women but also for their families. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was a condition that many of these women suffered from, although it wasn't recognized at the time. The symptoms of PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbness, and hypervigilance, were often misunderstood and misdiagnosed. For many, the stigma surrounding mental health only made their suffering more intense. Women who had been subjected to the brutality of war found themselves unable to articulate their trauma, and those around them often failed to understand the depth of their pain. The lack of recognition of mental health struggles meant that many former POWs were left to cope with their trauma in isolation. Some sought help through group therapy, but for many, mental health support was not readily available. The few available resources focused primarily on male veterans, and the emotional struggles of female POWs were often overlooked. However, over time, a shift began to occur. In the 1970s and 1980s, mental health awareness began to grow, and the impact of PTSD on female veterans, including former POWs, began to gain recognition. Advocacy groups and veterans organizations started to push for more support for women suffering from the psychological effects of war. The stories of these women, once hidden and dismissed, started to be acknowledged. As more POWs began to speak out about their experiences, the understanding of PTSD expanded, and society began to realize that mental health challenges needed to be treated with the same seriousness as physical injuries. For many of the German female POWs, the healing process was complicated by their sense of isolation and the difficulty of communicating their experiences. However, one of the most significant sources of emotional support for these women came from other former POWs. The bond shared between those who had experienced similar hardships was powerful and healing. Many women found solace in connecting with others who understood the trauma they had endured. After the war, former female POWs began to form tight-knit support groups where they could share their stories without judgment. These groups provided a safe space for women to talk about the emotional and psychological toll of captivity. The solidarity among former POWs was a lifeline for many, offering them the opportunity to express their pain and find understanding. Through these support networks, women were able to process their trauma together and begin the long journey of healing. While the personal relationships were challenging, many of these women also found themselves trying to rebuild their sense of identity in a post-war society that had drastically changed. Some women found new purpose by working with veterans organizations or becoming advocates for the recognition of the suffering of female POWs. Others chose to focus on raising their children and rebuilding their families. The struggle to rebuild a life after captivity was deeply tied to the women's sense of identity. Many had been forced into roles they had never imagined, and some had to reinvent themselves after the war. The desire for normalcy was strong, but it was often elusive. Over time, some women found new opportunities to engage in post-war life, but the scars of their experiences were never completely erased. Healing was not immediate. It took years, even decades, for many women to come to terms with their trauma. For some, the emotional scars lasted a lifetime. The journey to healing was often slow and difficult, but for many women, the acknowledgement of their suffering and the support of fellow POWs played a crucial role in their recovery. Over time, society began to recognize the resilience of these women, those who had endured the worst of war and captivity, yet still found the strength to rebuild their lives. The experiences of German female POWs, though vital in understanding the emotional and psychological cost of war, were largely neglected for decades. After their return to post-war Germany, many of these women were left to silently deal with their trauma, as the world around them struggled to recognize the unique hardships they had faced. The narrative of war, especially in the context of World War II, had been overwhelmingly focused on male soldiers, leaving little space for the stories of women, whether as civilians, soldiers, or prisoners. For years, these women carried the weight of their experiences in isolation. They were expected to return to normal life without ever truly acknowledging the toll captivity had taken on their bodies and minds. Their stories of resilience, trauma, and survival were not widely heard, and their struggles with reintegration were often dismissed. These women were expected to assimilate quietly into a society that had suffered the effects of war, but had not yet begun to understand the full scope of the psychological damage inflicted on its citizens, especially those who had been prisoners of war. However, in the decades following World War II, there was a gradual shift in how the experiences of POWs, especially female POWs, were understood. Societal awareness began to grow, and the need to address mental health and trauma became more apparent. Advocacy groups for veterans, including those focused on the experiences of female POWs, played a crucial role in bringing attention to the long-neglected stories of these women. In the post-war years, organizations like the German War Graves Commission, the American Ex-Prisoners of War, EPOW, and various groups in the UK began to provide support to veterans, including female POWs. These organizations were instrumental in raising awareness about the often overlooked suffering of female prisoners. Advocacy groups worked to ensure that the emotional and psychological trauma experienced by women was recognized and validated, paving the way for better mental health support and resources. In the 1970s and 1980s, as PTSD and the long-term psychological effects of war gained more attention in mainstream discourse, the plight of female POWs began to be more widely acknowledged. Public discussions about mental health and trauma began to break the stigma, and more attention was paid to the unique challenges faced by female veterans and POWs. For the first time, their experiences were given space in both public memory and academic research. As societies began to acknowledge the importance of remembering the experiences of female POWs, memorials and museums were established to honor their suffering and resilience. In Germany, the struggle to recognize the stories of female POWs was complicated by the nation's post-war guilt and its focus on the larger narrative of the war's devastation. Yet, over time, recognition of the personal suffering of these women grew. Memorials dedicated to female POWs began to spring up across Europe, especially in countries like the UK, France, and the United States. In the UK, the Royal British Legion became a significant voice for acknowledging the role of women during and after the war. These memorials, often located in cemeteries or near former POW camps, now serve as places of remembrance and healing. At the Imperial War Museum in London, dedicated exhibits began to tell the stories of female prisoners, detailing the conditions they endured and the emotional scars they carried with them after the war. These exhibits included personal letters, photographs, and oral histories, providing a platform for these often silent voices. Similarly, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans expanded its focus to include the experiences of female POWs, ensuring that their suffering and survival were not relegated to the margins of history. The inclusion of these stories in such high-profile public spaces was a testament to the growing recognition of the psychological and emotional impact of captivity on women. One of the most important shifts in the acknowledgement of female POW struggles came with the recognition of PTSD as a valid and serious condition. Although PTSD was not officially recognized until decades after the war, it became apparent in the late 20th century that the trauma faced by many veterans, especially female POWs, had lasting psychological effects. Veterans organizations began to advocate for better mental health support for female POWs, pushing for recognition of the trauma they had experienced during their imprisonment. As PTSD awareness grew, so did the resources available to help veterans cope with their experiences. Women who had suffered in silence for so long were now able to access therapy and counseling designed to help them heal from the emotional wounds of war. However, this process was not without resistance. Many veterans, both male and female, had been conditioned to believe that emotional pain was something to be endured silently. The stigma surrounding mental health remained strong for many years. Yet, over time, as more POWs shared their stories and as support systems became more accessible, the healing process for many of these women began in earnest. The trauma experienced by female POWs did not end with their generation. As the war's emotional legacy began to be understood, it became clear that the impact of captivity was passed down to future generations. Children and grandchildren of former POWs often grew up in homes where the psychological scars of war had left an indelible mark. Many of the children of former female POWs struggled with the effects of growing up with parents who had been emotionally distant or psychologically scarred by their war experiences. The emotional detachment, depression, and anxiety that many of these women exhibited affected their relationships with their families. In some cases, children became caregivers for their mothers, providing support for them as they navigated their emotional healing. As PTSD became more recognized, therapy and family counseling began to address not only the experiences of the veterans themselves but also the ways in which the trauma had affected their families. Intergenerational trauma was discussed more openly, leading to greater understanding and empathy for the families who had lived with the emotional consequences of the war. In recent years, the push to collect and preserve the stories of female POWs has gained momentum. Many former POWs, through memoirs, interviews, and oral history projects, have shared their accounts, ensuring that their voices are finally heard. These personal testimonies have become invaluable resources for future generations, offering a glimpse into the psychological and emotional toll of captivity that was once silenced. Historically, the stories of female POWs were overshadowed by the broader narratives of war, but through the efforts of veterans organizations, historians, and the survivors themselves, these stories are finally being told. They offer crucial insights into the human cost of war and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. The legacy of German female POWs is one of both suffering and survival. While they were subjected to the harsh realities of war and captivity, their stories also reflect the incredible strength of the human spirit. As time moves on, the recognition of their trauma and the acknowledgement of their resilience has become an integral part of understanding the full scope of World War II. The work done by veterans organizations, historians, and mental health professionals to bring these stories into the public consciousness is vital. These efforts have allowed for healing, not just for the women who lived through the war, but for future generations who can learn from the past and ensure that the sacrifices of those who endured war are never forgotten. The stories of these women serve as a powerful reminder of the cost of war, not just in terms of physical destruction, but in the emotional and psychological toll it exacts on individuals and families. As we continue to honor their memory, we must also continue to support those who live with the long-lasting effects of conflict, ensuring that their stories are never lost and their struggles are never forgotten. As time has passed since the end of World War II, the stories of female POWs, particularly the German women who endured captivity, have begun to find their rightful place in history. These women, whose experiences were often overlooked or dismissed for decades, are now seen as symbols of resilience, courage, and endurance. Their journey, from suffering in captivity to finding a voice in a post-war society that struggled to acknowledge their pain, is a testament to the power of memory and the importance of recognition. The path to healing for many of these women was long and difficult. It required not just the passage of time, but the efforts of historians, veterans organizations, and advocates who fought to bring their stories into the light. Today, these women's stories are not only remembered but honored in ways that offer closure for the veterans themselves and for future generations who can learn from their experiences. Through the growth of institutions dedicated to preserving history, the women who once remained silent are now being given a platform to share their voices. Whether through written accounts, oral histories, or the establishment of memorials, their experiences are finally being acknowledged as integral parts of the history of World War II. These efforts have been instrumental in creating a more inclusive and holistic understanding of the war, one that encompasses the often overlooked stories of those who suffered, fought, and survived in ways that were not initially seen as significant. In recognition of the contributions of female POWs, museums and memorials dedicated to the experiences of those who endured captivity have become increasingly common. Memorials to female POWs are often small but powerful, offering a space for reflection and remembrance. In countries like the UK and France, where many women were held in captivity, memorials dedicated to their struggle are places where families, friends, and the general public can honor their memory. The Imperial War Museum in London, for example, now features exhibits that explore the lives of female POWs, telling their stories through letters, personal accounts, and photographs. These exhibits emphasize the emotional and psychological aspects of their captivity, offering a glimpse into the hidden scars that these women carried long after their release. Visitors can walk through spaces filled with artifacts that provide a tangible connection to the past, each item telling the story of suffering, survival, and ultimately, resilience. Similarly, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans continues to highlight the experiences of POWs from all backgrounds, ensuring that the narratives of female prisoners are included alongside those of male soldiers. These museums not only educate the public, but also provide a space for veterans and their families to find solace and acknowledgement. In recent years, the rise of oral history projects has allowed many female POWs to tell their stories directly. For those who are still alive, these oral histories are invaluable resources that preserve the personal accounts of women who lived through unimaginable suffering. These testimonies offer more than just historical fact. They provide insight into the emotional and psychological landscapes of those who survived the war. Oral history projects like those conducted by the Veterans History Project in the US and similar initiatives in Europe have allowed former POWs to share their experiences in their own words. These personal narratives are being preserved in archives and are available to the public, ensuring that the lessons from these women's lives are passed down to future generations. They offer an unfiltered, raw perspective on the human cost of war, showing how war's impact extends beyond the battlefield. For many of these women, sharing their stories was a cathartic process, a way to reclaim their agency after years of silence and invisibility. For others, it was a form of justice, a way to ensure that their suffering and the suffering of their fellow prisoners was not forgotten. These testimonies have allowed for a more nuanced understanding of the war and its aftermath, highlighting the complexities of captivity and the long-term psychological effects on those who survived it. The impact of the stories of female POWs extends beyond the veterans themselves. These women's experiences have shaped how we think about the psychological toll of war and its lasting impact on individuals and families. By recognizing and acknowledging the trauma that these women faced, society has learned valuable lessons about the importance of mental health support for veterans, especially those who endured captivity. Modern-day veterans, particularly those returning from conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan, benefit from the groundwork laid by the recognition of PTSD in World War II veterans. The stories of female POWs, along with the growing recognition of mental health struggles faced by all war veterans, have led to greater understanding and support for those suffering from the long-term effects of trauma. These veterans are no longer expected to silently bear their burdens. Instead, they are given the space and the resources to heal. The legacy of the female POWs is also seen in the growing awareness of the emotional toll of war on families. As these stories have been shared and validated, the narrative of war has expanded to include not only the soldiers who fought but also the wives, children, and families who lived with the consequences of their service. Families are now more likely to seek help when dealing with the psychological aftermath of war, creating a ripple effect that impacts future generations. The importance of preserving the stories of female POWs cannot be overstated. In an era where many World War II veterans are passing away, it is crucial to continue the work of collecting and sharing their experiences. Many organizations, including museums, universities, and private collectors, are still working to ensure that these voices are not lost to history. Efforts to preserve their stories are now more important than ever, as the memory of World War II slowly fades with time. In schools and universities, the study of female POWs is slowly becoming a more prominent part of the World War II curriculum. By including these untold stories in academic studies, educators ensure that future generations learn about the full scope of WWII's impact, not just on soldiers, but on those who were caught in the web of war and its aftermath. The legacy of German female POWs is one of courage, survival, and resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity. These women faced horrors that are difficult to fully comprehend, yet they found ways to endure and survive. Their strength in the face of captivity, and their ability to rebuild their lives in the years following the war, is a testament to the human spirit's capacity for survival. As we continue to honor the memory of these women, we are reminded of the broader lessons their stories teach us. About the cost of war, the importance of mental health, and the unbreakable bonds that form through shared trauma and survival. Their experiences are not just a part of history, they are part of our collective humanity. By remembering their stories, we ensure that their sacrifices are never forgotten, and that we continue to support those who bear the scars of war, long after the fighting has ended.